The sound that shattered my world wasn't a scream or a crash, but the insistent shrill buzz of my phone against the polished floor of the rehearsal studio. It was a violation. Here in the hallowed halls of the New York City Ballet, the only sounds permitted were the soaring notes of Tchaikovsky, the squeak of pointe shoes on wood, and the measured, often breathless instructions of our ballet master Antoine. Everything else was sacrilege. My phone was always on silent. Always. But that Tuesday, in my haste in the dizzying euphoria of finally nailing the 32 fouette, turns that defined the role of the black swan I had forgotten. The buzzing was relentless, a frantic insect trying to burrow its way into the sacred silence. Antoine stopped the music with a sharp clap of his hands. Every dancer in the room froze, chests heaving, sweat cooling instantly on our skin. 50 pairs of eyes darted around, searching for the source of the disruption before finally landing on me. A hot flush of shame crept up my neck. I scurried to my bag, my heart hammering against my ribs, not from the exertion of the dance, but from pure humiliation. The caller ID flashed a picture of my mother, Sophia. I ducked out into the hallway, the cool air a shock against my damp leotard. I answered my voice a tight whisper, expecting a scolding for not calling her back sooner. But it was her voice, thin and frayed with a panic I hadn't heard since my grandfather's funeral, that made the floor seem to drop out from under me. She told me I had to come home. Right now. Not after rehearsal, not tonight. Now. I asked her what was wrong, if Dad was okay. Her answer was a choked sob, followed by a sharp command to just get in a cab and come to the Upper West Side. The line went dead. For a moment I stood paralyzed, the muffled orchestra music seeping through the studio doors, a ghost of the life I was living just 30 seconds earlier. That life was over. I knew it with a chilling certainty. Something had broken. I told Antoine there was a family emergency, his stern face softening with a flicker of concern as he saw the blood drain from mine. He nodded, granting me a permission I would have taken anyway. The taxi ride from the Lincoln Center to my parents' brownstone was a blur of yellow cabs, blaring horns and distorted city lights, seen through a film of unshed tears. My mind raced, creating 1,000 horrific scenarios. A car accident. A heart attack. I clutched the St. Genetius medallion around my neck, the patron saint of actors and dancers, and prayed to a god I wasn't sure I believed in anymore. I prayed for my father. Marco Rossi was the anchor of my world. While my mother saw my dancing as a frivolous, financially unstable hobby, my father saw it as my soul made visible. He was the one who drove me to lessons before dawn, who learned how to darn the ribbons on my pointe shoes because my mother refused, who sat through endless recitals, his booming applause the only one I ever listened for. He was a construction foreman, a man whose hands were calloused and strong, yet he handled my delicate dreams with the reverence of a scholar handling ancient scrolls. The thought of him being heard of that strength failing was inconceivable. When I burst through the front door of their house, the scene that greeted me was quiet, sterile, and far more terrifying than any accident. My mother Sophia was sitting ramrod straight on the velvet sofa, her face pale and puffy, her hands clenched so tightly in her lap her knuckles were white. My father Marco was slumped in his favorite leather armchair, looking smaller than I had ever seen him, his usually vibrant olive skin tinged with a sickly jaundiced yellow. And sitting opposite them, holding a leather briefcase on his lap, was Dr. Albright, our family doctor for over 20 years. The air was thick with a funereal solemnity. This wasn't an emergency, it was a verdict. My mother looked up as I entered, her eyes not filled with the relief of a mother seeing her child, but with a strange, calculating intensity. She told me to sit down, her voice devoid of its usual warmth. I remained standing, my dance bag slipping from my shoulder and hitting the Persian rug with a soft thud. I asked them what was happening, my voice trembling. It was Dr. Albright who spoke, his tone clinical and detached, as if he were discussing a faulty engine rather than the man who used to take him fishing. He explained that my father was in end-stage liver failure. The words didn't register at first. They were medical jargon, abstract and meaningless. Then he elaborated. He explained it was due to a rare aggressive genetic condition called alpha-1 antitrypsin deficiency, something that had lain dormant his whole life and had now chosen to savagely attack his liver. He said my father had at best a few months without a transplant, weeks more likely. The room began to spin. I gripped the back of a chair to steady myself. My father, my indestructible father, was dying. I looked at him, truly looked at him, and saw the truth of it in the hollows of his cheeks and the profound weariness in his eyes. He wouldn't meet my gaze. He just stared at his hands, the same hands that had built half the city and had always held me up. Then came the second blow, the one that wasn't delivered by fate but by my own mother. She spoke, her voice now firm, resolute. She said that there was hope, A living donor transplant. The waiting list for a cadaver liver was too long a death sentence in itself. But a living person, a relative, could donate a portion of their liver and both parts would regenerate. Hope flickered in my chest, a desperate tiny flame. We could save him. We had to find a match. His brother, my Uncle Paul. Someone. That's when my mother slid a file across the polished mahogany coffee table. My name was on the tab. Isabella Rossi. I stared at it confused. Sophia explained, her voice hardening with an unnerving practicality, that she and the doctor had already taken the necessary steps. She reminded me of the comprehensive blood work I'd had done 6 months ago for the ballet company's insurance policy. I had sent her the results, proud of my perfect health. She told me she had forwarded those results to the transplant team at Mount Sinai. She had done it without my knowledge, without my consent. She said my name as if she were bestowing a crown upon me. She declared that I was a perfect match. A 1 in a million textbook match. The flame of hope in my chest was instantly extinguished, replaced by an icy dread that spread through my veins. They hadn't just discovered my father was dying, they had found his cure. And it was me. I finally understood the nature of this gathering. This wasn't a family meeting to share tragic news. It was an ambush. I was not a daughter being told her father was ill. I was a resource being informed of its purpose. My mouth was dry. I struggled to form words. I tried to explain what a living donor transplant entailed. It wasn't like giving blood. It was a major invasive surgery, 6 to 8 hours under anesthesia. A massive incision across my abdomen, cutting through the very core muscles that were the engine of my entire art form. The recovery would be months, maybe a year. I would never dance the same way again. The explosive power for leaps, the iron control for balances, the fluid grace for turns, it would all be compromised, scarred over. It would be the end of my career. It would be the death of the only version of myself I had ever wanted to be. I had just been given the lead in Swan Lake. It wasn't just a role. It was the culmination of 20 years of sacrifice, of bleeding toes and missed proms, of a childhood given over to the bar. It was everything. I looked at my mother, pleading with her to understand. I told her it would destroy me. Her face, which had been a mask of strained composure, crumpled into something ugly and unrecognizable. Her voice rose sharp and venomous. She asked me how I could be so selfish. She spat the word dance as if it were a curse. She asked if a silly, childish fantasy was more important than my father's life. She demanded to know what kind of daughter I was to even hesitate. Each question was a stone hurled at me, meant to break me down, to shame me into submission. I turned to my father, my last hope. He was the one who understood. He had to. I begged him with my eyes to say something, to defend me, to defend the dream he had helped build. He slowly lifted his head, and his gaze was filled not with anger but with a profound and soul-crushing disappointment. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't have to. His words were quiet, but they carried the weight of a death sentence. He said he had always thought he had raised a daughter who understood family. He said he had worked his fingers to the bone so I could have my chances, and this was how I repaid him. He spoke of sacrifice, of duty, of blood. He made it clear that my body was not entirely my own. It belonged in part to the family that gave it to me, and now they were calling in the debt. The betrayal was absolute. It was a poison seeping into every happy memory I had of him. His applause at my recitals was no longer encouragement. It was an investment he was now cashing in. His pride was not for me, Isabella the artist, but for me, Isabella the asset. I started to back away, shaking my head, a strangled sob caught in my throat. I told them they couldn't ask this of me. It wasn't a question. It was a demand. I screamed that my life was mine. My body was mine. Dr. Albright stood up, then placing a placating hand on my mother's shoulder. He looked at me with a tired pity, as if I were a hysterical child. He told me it was a lot to process, but that time was of the essence. He said the surgical team was on standby. They wanted to schedule the procedure for the end of the week. He left a glossy brochure on the table titled The Gift of Life, a Guide for Living Donors. The Gift of Life. They were framing the dismemberment of my future as a present. I grabbed my bag from the floor and ran. I fled the house that was no longer a home, the air thick with their condemnation. As I slammed the door behind me, I heard my mother's final chilling words shouted through the wood. She screamed that if my father died, his blood would be on my hands. Out on the cold, indifferent streets of New York, the tears finally came hot and furious. They weren't tears of grief for my father's illness, but tears of rage at the theft they were attempting. They wanted to harvest me. They saw my strength, my youth, my perfect health, not as a part of who I was, but as a cure for him, and they were willing to sacrifice my entire world to get it. Walking through the darkening city, a different feeling began to take root beneath the pain and the fury. It was a cold, hard resolve. They thought I was selfish. They thought I was a bad daughter. They had shown me that their love was conditional, a transaction. They had pushed me into a corner expecting me to break, to surrender. They had miscalculated. They had not raised a fragile doll. They had raised a dancer. And a dancer's greatest strengths are discipline, endurance, and an absolute unyielding control over her own body. They wanted a piece of me to save my father. Very well. A dark, vengeful thought began to bloom in the ruins of my heart. They would get their wish, but not in the way they imagined. I would give them a sacrifice, yes. But first I would make them watch everything they were forcing me to burn. I would make them understand the true cost of the piece of me they so casually demanded. This would not be a gift. It would be a reckoning. My apartment is a shoebox, a 6th-floor walk-up in Hell's Kitchen that costs a laughable fortune, but it is mine. It is the one place on earth where I am not a daughter, not a dancer, not an asset, but simply Isabella. The 4 walls are a fortress I built with scraped-together savings from waitressing jobs between auditions. The air inside is my own smelling of Epsom salts, sweat, and the faint, sweet scent of the gardenia I keep struggling to keep alive on the fire escape. Tonight, that fortress felt like a tomb. I slammed the door shut, the chain rattling like a death knell, and leaned against it, my body trembling with a violent energy that had no outlet. The rage from my parents' house had carried me through the city streets, a burning shield against the shock. But here, in the sudden silence of my own space, the shield dissolved and the cold, crushing weight of reality crashed down on me. My father was dying. My mother had betrayed me. My life as I knew it was over. My phone began to buzz again. I ripped it from my pocket and saw my mother's name. I silenced it, then watched as it immediately lit up with a call from my father's number. I silenced that too. Then came a text. And another, and another. My Aunt Maria, my cousin Leo, my godmother, Sophia's sister. The family network, a system I once found suffocatingly loving, was being weaponized. I was no longer a niece or a cousin, I was a target, a problem to be solved. I turned the phone off and threw it onto my bed where it lay dark and inert, a dead thing. The silence that followed was louder than the buzzing. It was a cavernous emptiness filled only by the frantic thumping of my own heart and the ragged sound of my breathing. I slid down the door to the floor, my tutu from rehearsal still on the delicate tulle crushed and wrinkled beneath me. I felt like a broken doll. My eyes scanned the small room, a space so familiar it was an extension of my own body, and saw only ghosts. There on the bookshelf, propped up like a holy relic, was my first pair of professional point shoes. They were worn, the satin frayed at the tips, the ribbons stained with the sweat and blood of 1,000 pliés. I remembered the day my father bought them for me. I was 13. My mother had argued that they were an extravagance, that the cheaper student models were good enough. She told my father that he was spoiling me, filling my head with impossible dreams. But my father had just smiled his big warm smile. He had knelt before me in the middle of the store, his rough, calloused construction worker's hands taking my small foot as if it were made of glass. He had told the clerk with a voice swelling with a pride that filled the entire shop that his daughter was not a student anymore. He said she was an artist, and an artist required the finest tools. When he paid for them using cash he had saved in an envelope marked Bella's wings, he had looked at me, his dark eyes shining, and told me that these shoes would take me to places he could only dream of. He asked me only to remember the man who helped me fly. The memory, once a source of boundless warmth, now felt like a shard of ice in my chest. Had he been proud of me or proud of his investment? Was he giving me wings, or was he fattening up a prize bird for a future sacrifice? Every act of love, every word of encouragement was now tainted suspect. I felt a wave of nausea. The man who had knelt at my feet was the same man who had just condemned me from his armchair, his voice thick with disappointment that his asset was refusing to be liquidated. I peeled off the damp layers of my dance clothes, my body aching with a fatigue that went deeper than muscle. My feet, my most prized and tortured possessions, were a mess of blisters and bruises. I filled a basin with hot water and Epsom salts, the ritual so ingrained it was instinctual. As I submerged my feet, the stinging pain was a welcome distraction, a physical sensation to anchor me in the storm of my thoughts. As the steam rose, another memory surfaced unbidden. I was 16, preparing for a national competition. A week before the event, I landed a jump awkwardly and a sickening crack echoed through the studio. A severe ankle sprain. The doctor said I needed at least 6 weeks of complete rest. The competition was impossible. I remembered my mother's reaction. There was no sympathy, only a cold-clipped anger. She didn't ask if I was in pain. She went straight to logistics. She spoke of the non-refundable competition fees, the cost of the custom-made costume, the wasted hours of private coaching. She had looked at my swollen, purpled ankle with disgust, as if the injury were a personal failing, a deliberate act of sabotage against the family's finances. My father's reaction had been different. He had rushed to my side, his face a mask of concern. He had gently lifted my leg, his touch infinitely careful. He had told me not to worry about the money, not to worry about anything but healing. He had carried me to the car like a small child. At the time, I had clung to that memory as proof of his unconditional love, a stark contrast to my mother's rigid pragmatism. But now I replayed his words in the cold light of this new reality. Heal. Was he worried about his daughter's pain, or was he worried about the condition of his prized instrument? He had insured my legs for a small fortune the year before. I had thought it was a touching, if slightly dramatic gesture of his belief in me. Now it felt like he was simply protecting his property. The truth began to reveal itself in these fractured reflections of the past. My mother had always seen me as a cost. My father had always seen me as an investment. But neither, it seemed, had ever truly seen me as just their daughter. A sharp, insistent knock on my door jolted me from my reverie. It wasn't the frantic pounding of a panicked parent, but a calm, measured rhythm. I froze. No one came to my apartment unannounced. I crept to the door and looked through the peephole. My blood ran cold. It was my Uncle Paul, my father's younger brother. Paul was the family's diplomat. Where my father was a thunderstorm, Paul was a gentle rain. He was the one who mediated arguments, who smoothed over hurt feelings, who always seemed to find the reasonable middle ground. He was the person I trusted most in the world after my father. His presence here meant one thing: they had sent their most effective weapon. I opened the door, a crack, the chain still in place. He looked at me with his kind, sad eyes, his shoulders slumped. He didn't try to push his way in. He just asked if he could talk to me for a few minutes. He said he wasn't here to yell, only to help me understand. Against my better judgment, I let him in. The betrayal was still too raw, and a foolish part of me hoped that he at least would be on my side. He sat on my small sofa, looking out of place in his expensive suit amidst my world of worn furniture and dance posters. He started gently. He told me my mother was beside herself with fear and grief, and that she wasn't thinking clearly. He told me my father was a proud man, and that his fear was coming out as anger and disappointment. He painted them as victims of circumstance, their terrible demand a product of desperation, not malice. He was trying to reframe the ambush as a cry for help. I just stared at him, my arms crossed over my chest. I told him he didn't understand what they had asked of me. That's when his demeanor shifted. The gentle sympathy hardened into a grave seriousness. He told me that there was something I didn't know, a secret the family had kept from me my whole life to protect me. He leaned forward, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper. He explained that my father's genetic condition wasn't a recent discovery. They had known about it for 15 years. They had found out during a routine screening after his own father, my grandfather, had died of a mysterious liver ailment. The room fell silent. 15 years. They had known for 15 years that this was a possibility, a ticking time bomb inside him. They had watched me grow up, watched me train, watched me pour my entire being into my body, all while knowing that one day they might come to claim a piece of it. I felt a profound, horrifying clarity. I was not a happy accident, a one-in-a-million match found in a moment of crisis. I was Plan B. I had always been Plan B. My uncle, seeing the horror on my face, pressed his advantage. He tried to frame their secrecy as an act of love. He said they didn't want me to live my life in fear or with the burden of that knowledge. They wanted me to have a normal childhood. But his words were hollow. It wasn't about protecting me. It was about preserving the asset. An asset that might have made different life choices had she known the truth. Then he delivered the final devastating blow. He told me my father truly believed it was destiny. He said, my father saw it as a sign from God that after he was diagnosed, they were blessed with a perfectly healthy daughter. He told me, his voice thick with a twisted piety, that my father had always believed I was brought into this world for a purpose, and that purpose was now clear. My purpose was to save him. The last vestiges of love and loyalty in my heart for my family turned to dust and blew away. It was no longer about a desperate choice made in a moment of panic. This was premeditated. My entire life, my every success had been viewed through the lens of my biological utility. My strong, healthy dancer's body wasn't a testament to my hard work. It was a godsend, a custom-ordered spare part for my father. I stood up, my movements stiff, robotic. I walked to the door and opened it. I told my Uncle Paul to get out. My voice was eerily calm, devoid of the hysteria they had expected. The calm seemed to frighten him more than any scream would have. He tried to say my name to offer more platitudes, but I cut him off. I told him to tell my parents that I had heard their message. I understood my purpose now. He left a confused and worried look on his face, no doubt believing his mission had failed. But he was wrong. It hadn't failed. It had succeeded beyond their wildest dreams. They wanted to make me understand my place in this family. And now I did. I was not a daughter, I was a sacrifice. And a sacrifice by its very nature is a performance. I closed the door and leaned against it, but this time there was no trembling. The emotional storm had passed. In its place was a vast, cold, and silent landscape of absolute certainty. The grief was gone, burned away by the white-hot fire of this ultimate betrayal. They had made a grave error in telling me the truth. They thought the weight of this destiny would crush me into submission. Instead, it had given me a spine of steel. I walked to the window and looked out at the city lights, a glittering tapestry of millions of lives, millions of dreams. They wanted to take mine and call it a gift. They wanted me to play the part of the dutiful, sacrificial daughter. Very well, I would play a part. But I would be the one to write the script. The Black Swan was a role I had perfected, a transformation from innocence to dark, vengeful power. The performance I was about to give, however, would not be on a stage. It would be in the sterile white rooms of a hospital and the suffocating confines of my family home. And it would not end with a bow. It would end with their ruin. The next morning, I woke to a pain that had nothing to do with my exhausted muscles. It was a hollow ache deep in my soul, the phantom limb pain of a life that had been amputated. For 20 years, my day had a rhythm, a sacred ritual dictated by the demands of the bar. Wake, stretch, hydrate, train, push, bleed, perfect repeat. It was a monastic existence, and the studio was my sanctuary. Today, for the first time, I had nowhere to go. My purpose had been stolen. This, I realized as I stared at the ceiling, was the peak of my suffering. This was the bottom. I forced myself out of bed and into the shower, letting the scalding water beat down on my back. The grief was a physical weight pressing on my chest, making it hard to breathe. They hadn't just asked for a piece of my liver. They had asked me to kill the person I had spent my entire life becoming. They had asked me to murder Isabella the dancer so that Marco the father could live. The unfairness of it was a bitter poison in my throat. But as the water sluiced over me, the cold resolve from the night before began to crystallize. The grief was still there, but something else was growing alongside it, a white-hot, diamond-hard rage. They thought they had broken me. They thought I was a child who would eventually cry herself into submission. They were about to learn that the discipline of ballet forges not just a body of muscle and grace, but a will of iron. I stepped out of the shower and looked at my reflection in the fogged mirror. I didn't see a victim. I saw a warrior. My body, the thing they saw as a spare part, was my armor and my weapon. The performance of my life was about to begin, and it required a costume. I dressed carefully, not in my usual dancer's attire of leggings and worn-out sweaters, but in a simple, elegant black dress, heels, and a single string of pearls my grandmother had left me. I looked like a young woman attending a funeral. In a way, I was. My first stop was the Lincoln Center. Walking through those grand doors, a place that had always felt like coming home, was an act of self-inflicted torture. I could hear the faint echo of a piano from a distant rehearsal room. I could smell the familiar scent of rosin and old wood. Every atom of this building screamed my name, and I had to walk away from it. This pain, this agonizing farewell, was necessary. I needed to feel the full weight of what they were taking from me to let it fuel the fire of my revenge. I found Antoine in his office. He looked up, his usually stern face softening with concern when he saw me. I didn't cry. My voice was steady, my composure absolute. I informed him that my family emergency was ongoing and that I would have to withdraw from the production of Swan Lake. I told him it was a matter of life and death, which was in its own way the truth. He didn't press for details. He was a man who understood sacrifice. He saw the truth in my eyes, the bleak finality of my decision. He told me that the role would be waiting for me should my circumstances change, a kind lie we both knew was impossible. The understudy would take over, the show would go on, and the world of ballet would forget my name before my surgical scar had even begun to fade. As I turned to leave, he called my name. He simply said he was sorry and that the stage would be a lesser place without me. That small, genuine acknowledgement of my loss of my art was a kindness so profound it almost shattered my composure. I nodded, unable to speak, and walked out without looking back. The walk away from the Lincoln Center was the longest walk of my life. Each step was a severing. The peak of my suffering was standing on that plaza, the fountain playing merrily behind me, knowing I would never again belong to the world inside that building. The grief was a physical blow, knocking the wind out of me. I leaned against a cold stone wall, the noise of the city fading to a dull roar. This was it, the death of my dream. But as the last tear of grief fell, the cold fire of vengeance took its place. The pain was not gone, but it had been transmuted. It was no longer a weight, but a weapon. I took out my phone, turned it on, and ignored the flood of notifications. I made 2 calls. The first was to Dr. Albright's office. I left a message with his nurse, my voice cool and professional, stating that I, Isabella Rossi, would be in touch regarding the donation and that all future medical correspondence was to be directed to me and me alone. The second call was to my mother. She answered on the first ring, her voice a jumble of panic and relief. I cut her off. I told her that I needed to see them. I was coming to the house in 1 hour for a family meeting. I told her to have my father and Uncle Paul there. Then I hung up. I did not ask. I commanded. For the first time, I felt a flicker of power, a small, satisfying spark in the cold emptiness of my grief. When I arrived at the brownstone, the 3 of them were waiting in the living room, their expressions a mixture of apprehension and hope. They looked like a tribunal waiting to pass judgment. But I was no longer the defendant. I was the prosecutor. I did not sit down. I stood in the center of the room, the black dress making me a stark, solemn figure against their plush, comfortable furniture. I let the silence stretch, forcing them to study me to see the change. Finally, I spoke. I told them that I had made my decision. I watched as a wave of relief washed over my uncle's face, as my mother's tightly clasped hands relaxed slightly. They thought they had won. I informed them that I would consent to the surgery. I would donate a portion of my liver to save my father's life. My mother let out a small sob and whispered a thank you to God. My father looked at the floor, his shoulders slumping in what I knew was not relief but shame. Then, as the architect of this tragedy, I laid out my terms. I explained that this was not a duty nor an obligation. It was a gift. And a gift of this magnitude came with a price not of money but of performance. I told them that since this was a family matter, the family would celebrate it. My first condition was that they would host a formal family dinner that Sunday. Everyone, Aunt Maria, Cousin Leo, all the relatives who had been texting and calling me, pressuring me, had to be there. At this dinner, we would announce my beautiful, selfless decision together. I wanted to watch them all, the entire jury of my peers, toast to the saint they had tried to bully into submission. I wanted to see the triumphant look on my mother's face as she paraded her obedient daughter in front of everyone. The first small taste of satisfaction warmed me. The pain in my soul lessened, replaced by the thrill of the puppeteer pulling the first string. My second condition was for my father. I looked directly at him, forcing him to meet my gaze. I told him that before they took my career, he would bear witness to it. He was to attend my final performance. The company owed me one last show as a contractual farewell. I would dance the lead in Swan Lake one last time that Friday. I told him he was not just to attend. He and my mother were to sit in the front row center stage. He would not be allowed to look away. He would have to watch every leap, every turn, every drop of sweat. He would have to sit there for 3 hours and watch in intimate, excruciating detail exactly what his life was costing me. I wanted him to see the ghost of my future before he forced me to kill it. He flinched as if I had struck him, and a deeper, more profound satisfaction flowed through me. The pain was still there, but it was being overshadowed by this cold, delicious power. My final condition was one of control. I stated that from this moment on, all communication regarding the surgery scheduling, consultations, paperwork would go through me. No one was to contact me on my parents' behalf. Dr. Albright was to speak only to me. My body, my choice, my terms. I was no longer the subject of the conversation. I was in charge of it. They were stunned into silence. This was not the tearful, broken surrender they had expected. This was a treaty negotiation, and I was dictating the terms of their victory. My mother, ever the pragmatist, was the first to recover. The price was acceptable. A dinner party and a night at the ballet were nothing in exchange for her husband's life. She agreed to everything, a triumphant smile playing on her lips. My father just nodded, his face pale and grim. He understood. He knew this wasn't a gift. It was the beginning of his punishment. That Sunday, the dinner was a grotesque masterpiece of hypocrisy. The house was filled with the aroma of roasted lamb and the loud, cheerful chatter of my extended family. I was the guest of honor, the returning prodigal daughter. I played my part to perfection. I was demure, gracious, and brave. Aunt Maria hugged me, her tears dampening my dress, telling me that she knew I had it in me to be a good girl. Cousin Leo shook his head in performative awe, telling everyone that he could never do what I was doing, that I was on another level of heroism. The peak of the performance came with the toast. My mother stood, her crystal glass held high, and delivered a speech about the power of family, the bonds of love, and the incredible selfless sacrifice her youngest daughter was making. She spoke of my courage and my deep abiding love for my father. Her voice was thick with emotion, her eyes shining with unshed tears. It was a flawless performance. Everyone turned to me, their faces glowing with admiration. They toasted my health, my bravery, my sacrifice. I stood and raised my glass of water. I smiled, a gentle, beatific smile that did not reach my eyes. I thanked them all. I told them that a family like ours was worth any sacrifice. And as I looked at my mother basking in the glory of her successful martyrdom by proxy, and my father who sat staring into his wineglass like it held the abyss, I felt it. The pain from my lost dream, the agony of my stolen future was still there, a cold stone in the pit of my stomach. But for the first time, it was surrounded by something else. A profound, exhilarating, and deeply satisfying sense of control. The suffering was no longer all-consuming. It was now just the cost of admission to my own theater of revenge. The applause from that farcical Sunday dinner echoed in the silence of my apartment for days. It was a hollow, haunting sound. My family believed they were applauding a saint, but I knew they were cheering for their own reflection, celebrating a victory they had won through emotional brutality. The pain of my impending loss hadn't vanished, but it now had a purpose. It was the fuel, and revenge was the engine. The feeling of satisfaction, so new and potent, was a drug, and I found myself craving another dose. My next opportunity came on Wednesday at the pre-operative consultation at Mount Sinai. I had insisted on attending alone with my parents, explicitly excluding my Uncle Paul, the family's gentle manipulator. I needed my audience captive and undistracted. We sat in a sterile white room, the air smelling of antiseptic and anxiety. My mother was attempting a facade of cheerful maternal concern, while my father stared at a spot on the floor, the weight of his guilt, a visible shroud around his shoulders. Dr. Evans, the head of transplant surgery, entered. He was a kind-looking man with tired eyes, and he spoke to me as if I were a fragile child making a noble sacrifice. He started to explain the procedure in gentle, simplified terms. This was my opening. I calmly opened the notebook I had brought. For the past 48 hours, I hadn't been stretching or rehearsing. I had been studying. I had devoured every medical journal article, every patient testimonial, every surgical textbook chapter on hepatectomies I could find online. I was no longer just a dancer. I was an expert on the destruction of my own body. I interrupted Dr. Evans mid-sentence, my voice polite but firm. I told him that I appreciated the sentiment, but that I did not need the simplified version. I then began my interrogation. I asked him to confirm the specific percentage of post-operative nerve damage associated with a right lobe resection. I asked him to detail the statistical probability of developing a chronic incisional hernia and what that would mean for an athlete's core stability. I watched my mother's smile falter as I spoke. I continued my questions, becoming more precise, more brutal. I asked the doctor to explain the long-term prognosis for muscle atrophy in the rectus abdominis and the internal and external obliques, the very muscles that allowed me to leap and turn. I asked him to show me on a diagram exactly where the 10-inch incision would be and how it would permanently sever the fascia connecting those muscle groups. With each question, I would glance at my parents. My mother's face had gone from pale to ashen. She was hearing in cold clinical detail the butchery she had demanded. This wasn't the gift of life from a glossy brochure anymore. This was a discussion of permanent debilitating injury. My father, who had built his life with his body, understood the language of physical cost. I saw him physically recoil when I asked Dr. Evans to confirm that I would never regain 100% of my original core strength. It was a medical impossibility. The doctor, to his credit, answered every question with professional honesty, his initial, gentle demeanor replaced by a grudging respect for my thoroughness. I was not a hysterical girl. I was an informed patient, and he was obligated to provide the facts. I had turned his medical expertise into my weapon. I forced my parents to listen to the unvarnished, ugly truth of what they were asking me to do. I made them confront the reality that they weren't just taking a part of my liver. They were taking my entire physical identity piece by severed muscle fiber. By the end of the 30-minute consultation, my mother looked like she was going to be sick. My father couldn't look at me at all. I, on the other hand, felt a profound and chilling calm. I closed my notebook, looked Dr. Evans in the eye, and told him that I understood the risks and was ready to proceed with the scheduling for the following week. My voice was the epitome of reasonable, decisive control. The satisfaction was immense. The pain was still there, but now it felt like a scar from a battle I was winning, not a fresh wound from an attack I had lost. The next 2 days were a blur of final rehearsals. My decision had spread through the company like wildfire. I was met with a mixture of pity, disbelief, and awe. Alexei, my partner for Swan Lake, cornered me by the water fountain. He was a stoic Russian who rarely showed emotion, but his eyes were filled with a desperate confusion. He told me, his voice a low rumble, that what I was doing was madness. He said a talent like mine came once in a generation, and to throw it away was a crime against the art form itself. He begged me to reconsider, to run away, to choose my life. I simply told him that the choice had been made and that all I asked was that he help me make this final performance something no one would ever forget. He saw the resolve in my eyes and said no more. But during our rehearsals, he danced with a ferocity that matched my own, his grip sure and strong, as if he were trying to hold me back from the edge of a cliff. That Friday night, the theater was electric. Backstage, the air was thick with the scent of hairspray and the nervous energy that always preceded a show. But for me, it was different. It wasn't nerves. It was the calm focus of an executioner. I sat at my dressing table, applying the stark white makeup of Odette the White Swan. I could see the reflection of the stage manager in my mirror, mouthing to an assistant and pointing towards the audience. I knew what he was saying. "They're here." I peeked through the curtain. And there they were. Front row center. My father looking small and broken in his best suit. My mother dressed to the nines, a tense, regal smile plastered on her face, ready to play the part of the proud mother of the tragic heroine. They were perfectly positioned with no escape. The overture began and the curtain rose. For the first 2 acts, I danced the role of Odette with a heartbreaking purity. Every movement was filled with a fragile, ethereal grace. I wasn't just performing the role of a cursed swan princess. I was performing the ghost of my own lost innocence. I danced for the girl who believed her father's love was a fortress. With every delicate extension, every sorrowful glance, I directed my performance at him. I made sure he saw the beauty, the grace, the delicate perfection of the thing he had chosen to shatter. During the adagio, I looked directly at him. I saw that his face was wet with tears, his shoulders shaking with silent sobs. My mother placed a hand on his arm, but not for comfort. It was a command to hold himself together. The satisfaction was so sharp, so clear, it felt like a perfect note held in the silent air. Then came the intermission. I returned to my dressing room and transformed. The white feathers were replaced with black. The soft, sorrowful makeup was wiped away and replaced with the sharp, seductive lines of Odile the Black Swan. The rage I had been holding back, the grief I had been channeling into sorrow, was now unleashed. When I stepped back on stage, I was no longer a victim. I was a predator. Odile is a role of power, deception, and triumphant malice. I danced it not for the audience, but as a direct assault on the 2 people in the front row. The famous 32 fouette turns were not a display of technical brilliance. They were a declaration of war. Each turn was a whip crack, a spin of accusation. 1 for the lies, 2 for the betrayal, 3 for the stolen future. On and on, faster and more precise, a vortex of fury in black tulle. I saw my mother's proud smile completely vanish, replaced by a look of sheer, unadulterated fear. She was not seeing her daughter on stage anymore. She was seeing a monster of her own creation. In the final moments of the ballet, as the cursed prince realizes his betrayal, I did not dance with triumph. I danced with a cold, terrifying emptiness. I had won. I had destroyed him. And in doing so, I had destroyed myself. As the curtain fell to a thunderous, roaring ovation, I stood center stage, my chest heaving. I did not bow to the audience. I held my gaze fixed on my parents. My father was openly weeping now, his face buried in his hands. My mother was frozen, her face a mask of horror, finally understanding. This was not a sacrifice. This was a curse. And it was just beginning. The standing ovation was a tsunami of sound, but I heard none of it. In the space between the falling curtain and the roar of the crowd, there was a pocket of absolute silence populated only by me and the two shattered figures in the front row. The performance was over, but the final act of my theater of revenge had just begun. I took my bows, a serene, chilling smile on my lips, my eyes never leaving theirs. I wanted them to know that every cheer, every bravo was a testament to the magnitude of their crime. Back in my dressing room, the air was thick with the scent of wilting flowers and the suffocating congratulations of the other dancers. They saw only the triumph, not the funeral pyre. I accepted their praise with a detached grace, my mind already on the next move. My parents were waiting for me as I knew they would be. They had been instructed to meet me here to complete the public facade of a proud, supportive family. When I finally let them in, the contrast was jarring. My mother, usually so immaculately composed, looked haggard. Her expensive silk dress was wrinkled, her makeup slightly smeared. My father was a ghost. The jaundice seemed to have deepened in the last 3 hours, his skin the color of old parchment. He couldn't meet my eyes. He just stared at the floor, a condemned man waiting for the axe to fall. My mother tried to speak, to offer some empty praise for the performance, but the words died in her throat. She had seen what I had done on that stage. I hadn't just danced. I had confessed. I had shown her and the world the brutal murder of my own soul, and I had made it beautiful. She was speechless, not with awe but with horror. I didn't offer them a seat. I didn't offer them comfort. I began to methodically remove my stage makeup, watching them in the mirror. I told them that the car to the hospital was scheduled to pick me up at 6 a.m. the next morning. My surgery was scheduled for 8 a.m. His was to follow immediately after. I laid out the details with the cool efficiency of a military planner, my voice, even my hands, steady. Every word was another turn of the screw. My father finally looked up, his voice a hoarse whisper. He told me that I didn't have to do this. He said he had been wrong, that he couldn't let me destroy myself for him. The words which a week ago would have been my salvation were now utterly meaningless. It was too late. The train had left the station and he was tied to the tracks. I turned from the mirror to face him directly, my expression unreadable. I told him that it was never about him. Not anymore. I explained that I was doing this because I had given my word. I reminded him that a Rossi, as he had always taught me, never goes back on their word. I was using his own rigid code of honor against him, twisting it into a cage. He flinched, recognizing his own words being used to seal his fate. My mother, seeing her husband's resolve crumbling, stepped forward. Her fear had been replaced by a desperate, renewed anger. She accused me of being cruel, of tormenting my father in his final days. She asked what kind of monster I had become. I laughed. It was a cold, empty sound that echoed in the small room. I told her that she was the one who had created me. She had wanted a selfless saint, and when she didn't get one, she had settled for a monster. I informed her that this was her victory, and she would damn well see it through to the end. I then dismissed them, telling them to get some rest. They would need it for the big day tomorrow. They left like two sleepwalkers, their spirits utterly broken, stumbling out of my dressing room and away from the life they had known. The satisfaction I felt was cold and clean, like the air on a winter morning. It wasn't the fiery pleasure of the performance, but the quiet, deep satisfaction of a plan perfectly executed. The pain was still a part of me, but it no longer burned. It was a core of ice, giving me strength and clarity. The next morning, I was the first one at the hospital. I checked myself in, signed the final consent forms, and was led to a pre-operative room. I changed into the thin, humiliating hospital gown and waited. At 7:30 a.m., a nurse came in to start my IV. She was kind and chatty, telling me I was the bravest person she had ever met. She had read about my story in a hospital newsletter that my mother, in a final act of hubris, had arranged with their PR department. Ballerina's ultimate sacrifice for father. I just smiled. At 7:45 a.m., Dr. Evans came in to see me. He looked tired but focused. He asked if I had any final questions. I told him I had only one. I asked him to confirm for the record that my consent was voluntary and that I could at any point up until the administration of anesthesia withdraw it. He looked at me, a flicker of understanding in his tired eyes. He confirmed that was my absolute right as a patient. I thanked him and told him I was ready. As they wheeled my gurney out of the room, we passed the waiting area. My entire family was there, my parents, my uncle, my aunt, my cousins. They were a somber, anxious crowd waiting for the pound of flesh they had been promised. My mother tried to reach for my hand, her face a mask of desperate hope. I pulled it away. I gave them all one last long look, letting them see the calm, resolute expression on my face. This was the final image I wanted seared into their minds, the lamb walking to her own slaughter, completely serene. They wheeled me into the operating theater. The room was bright, cold, and filled with the quiet hum of machinery. The surgical team moved with a calm professionalism. The anesthesiologist came to my side and told me she was about to administer the medication that would put me to sleep. She told me to count backward from 10. This was the moment. The culmination of everything. The grief, the rage, the pain, the cold satisfaction. It all led to this final, irreversible choice. 10. I began, my voice clear and steady in the silent room. I saw the anesthesiologist's hand move toward the valve on my IV line. 9. I thought of my father lying in a room down the hall, prepped for a surgery that would save his life. 8. I thought of my mother wringing her hands in the waiting room, praying for the success of her monstrous plan. 7. I thought of the stage, the music, the feeling of flight. A final sharp pang of grief, a farewell to the ghost of myself. 6. I thought of their betrayal, the cold, calculated decision they had made 15 years ago. 5. The anesthesiologist's fingers were on the valve. I looked directly into her eyes. And then I delivered the final line of my performance. I withdraw my consent, I said. The words hung in the sterile air, more powerful than any anesthetic. The anesthesiologist froze her hand, hovering over the IV. The surgical team stopped moving. Dr. Evans, who was scrubbing in at a sink, turned around, his face unreadable. I sat up on the gurney, the thin gown falling from my shoulder. My voice did not shake. It was the calm, commanding voice of a person in absolute control. I repeated myself so there could be no misunderstanding. I am of sound mind. I am revoking my consent for this procedure. You do not have my permission to operate. A stunned, dead silence filled the operating room. The machinery hummed on, indifferent. Dr. Evans walked over, his expression grim. He knew he was legally bound. There was nothing he could do. He simply nodded and told the nurses to help me get dressed. The walk from the operating theater back to the waiting room was the true victory lap. I was not on a gurney. I was on my own 2 feet. I was not in a patient's gown, but in my own clothes. The nurse who had called me brave now looked at me with wide, confused eyes. I pushed open the doors to the waiting room. The entire family looked up, expecting to see a doctor with news. Instead, they saw me. Healthy. Whole. Unscarred. My mother was the first to react. A confused sound, half question, half gasp, escaped her lips. She asked what had happened, if something was wrong. I looked at her, then at my father, then at all of them, the jury and the executioners, and I delivered my verdict. I told them that nothing was wrong. I had simply changed my mind. I told them that the gift, as they had called it, was withdrawn. I saw the comprehension dawn on my mother's face, first a slow-motion wave of horror that contorted her features into a mask of utter disbelief. Then my father understood. The flicker of hope he might have had, the belief that my cruelty had a limit, was extinguished. He just sagged in his chair, a man hollowed out, his body giving up before his disease even had the chance. The rest of the family stared, their mouths agape, caught between shock and outrage. They were utterly, completely silent. They were deadlocked, paralyzed by the audacity of what I had done. I had brought them to the absolute brink. I had made them live through the hope of salvation, made them witness the cost, made them sit through the funeral of my life, and then at the last possible second I had pulled the plug. I left them there in that sterile waiting room with nothing but the echo of their coming loss and the full crushing weight of their own monstrous actions. I turned my back on them and walked out of the hospital, not into the death of a surgical recovery, but into the bright, cold, and gloriously empty first day of my new life. The pain was still a part of me, but it was a quiet, distant thing now. The satisfaction was absolute. The weeks following what my family later referred to as the incident at Mount Sinai were defined by a profound and deafening silence. My phone did not ring. No desperate texts appeared on my screen. My Uncle Paul, the family's silver-tongued diplomat, did not show up at my door. It was as if in walking out of that hospital I had ceased to exist. I had not just withdrawn my consent. I had withdrawn myself from the fabric of their lives, and they, in their shock and impotent rage, had allowed the tear to remain. This silence was not peaceful. It was a heavy, suffocating blanket. In the quiet of my apartment, every creak of the floorboards, every siren in the distant city felt like an accusation. The adrenaline of my revenge had faded, leaving behind the hollow ache of my reality. I had won. I had destroyed their hope as they had destroyed my dream. But victory, I was discovering, was a lonely, desolate landscape. I didn't dance. I couldn't bring myself to even stretch. My body, which had been the battlefield for this war, felt alien to me. I would look at my legs, my feet, my core, and see not an instrument of art but a piece of evidence from a crime scene. I had saved my career, but I had poisoned the well. The joy was gone, replaced by the bitter taste of what it had cost. About a month after I walked out of the hospital, a letter arrived. It was not a bill or junk mail. The envelope was thick, cream-colored, and the handwriting was the familiar, elegant script of my Uncle Paul. I let it sit on my kitchen counter for 2 days, a white flag from a war I wasn't sure was over. Finally, I opened it. The letter was not what I expected. There were no pleas, no accusations, no attempts at guilt. It was a confession. Paul wrote that after I left the hospital, the family had shattered. The silence I was experiencing was the sound of the pieces falling. He wrote that my father's health had declined rapidly, not just from the disease, but from what he called a sickness of the soul. My father had refused to see anyone, including my mother. He had locked himself away, not in his room, but in his own silence. But the most devastating part of the letter was the truth he finally revealed. He wrote that my mother had been the true architect of the entire plan from the very beginning. 15 years ago, when they first learned of my father's diagnosis, it was she who had seen me not as a daughter but as a biological insurance policy. My father, in his fear and weakness, had gone along with it. He had loved me, Paul insisted in his own flawed way, but his love was no match for my mother's terrifying pragmatic determination and his own fear of death. He then confessed his own role. He told me that the story he had told me that I was a gift from God born for the purpose of saving my father was a lie he had concocted with my mother. They had thought that framing it as destiny, as a holy purpose, would be the most effective way to break my will. They had weaponized faith and fate against me. He wrote that he would carry the shame of that manipulation to his grave. The letter ended with a simple, stark piece of news. A suitable liver had unexpectedly become available from a deceased donor, a young man who had died in a motorcycle accident. My father had undergone the transplant surgery 3 days prior. The procedure was a success. He was expected to make a full recovery. He was going to live. I read the letter 3 times. The news that my father would live did not bring relief or joy or even anger. It brought a strange, hollow emptiness. My entire performance, my grand, tragic, vengeful ballet, had been rendered in the end completely and utterly unnecessary. I had sacrificed my family, my peace of mind, and the pure love I once had for my art, all for a battle that was ultimately won by a random twist of fate. The irony was so profound, so cruel, it was almost poetic. I had been given the ultimate checkmate. I had orchestrated this grand theater of revenge, forcing them to confront the cost of their demand, only to have the universe render the entire premise moot. I had not saved him. I had not condemned him. I had in the end done nothing at all. A week later, a second letter arrived. This one was from my father. The handwriting was shaky, the script of a man relearning how to use his own hands. It was short. He did not ask for forgiveness. He knew he had no right. He did not make excuses. He simply told me that in the long, silent hours in the hospital waiting for a death he was sure was coming, he had understood. He wrote that the greatest pain was not his failing body but the memory of my face on that stage. He had seen my soul, he wrote, and he had seen that he had been the one to break it. He told me that he was grateful for his second chance at life, but that he knew he had lost me to get it. He ended the letter by saying that the only thing he would pray for the rest of his days was that I would one day find it in myself to dance again, not for him, not for an audience, but just for me. That letter was the thing that finally broke through the ice. The tears I shed were not tears of rage or satisfaction, but of a deep, sorrowful grief. I wept for the father I had lost long before his liver began to fail. I wept for the girl who had loved dancing with a pure, uncomplicated joy. I wept for the beautiful, terrible waste of it all. I did not see my parents again for over a year. There was no dramatic reconciliation. There couldn't be. The wounds were too deep, the trust too irrevocably shattered. But the silence was eventually broken, replaced by a tentative, fragile truce conducted through carefully worded emails and the occasional awkward holiday card. I did eventually go back to the bar. It was in a small, anonymous studio downtown, far from the hallowed halls of the Lincoln Center. The first time I tried to move my body felt like a stranger's. The rage was gone and the grief had softened to a dull ache. There was only a profound emptiness. But as I moved slowly and imperfectly, something began to shift. I wasn't dancing for a role or for an audience or for my father's approval. I was dancing because the silence had become too much to bear and my body still remembered the language of music. The lesson I realized was brutal and absolute. I had set out to teach my family the price of my body, but I had learned the price of my own revenge. I had won, but the victory had cost me nearly everything. My revenge had been a brilliant, all-consuming fire. It had burned them, yes, but it had also burned me. It had scorched the landscape of my own heart, leaving me standing alone in the ashes. My father got his life, my mother got her husband, and I got my body back whole and unscarred but haunted. I learned that some gifts are too expensive to accept and some victories are too costly to win. The ultimate truth is that when you dance with the devil, you don't get to lead, and when the music stops, you are left alone on the dance floor with nothing but the echo of the silence and the ghost of who you used to be. The stage was dark, the audience gone. It was time to learn a new dance, a quiet, solitary performance just for me. It was the dance of healing.